When I first pulled my boat into the driveway of my newly acquired property on the edge of the lake, I thought little of the reactions it might cause. To me, the boat was not a luxury, not an ornament, but an essential part of what drew me to this place in the first place. The lake was calm, expansive, and beautiful, reflecting the sky like glass in the early mornings. Owning a property here meant having the chance to reconnect with the water whenever I wanted, to push out into the open expanse with nothing but the sound of waves and wind around me. It was the dream I had worked toward for years, and finally, it was becoming reality. Yet, what I did not anticipate was how quickly this dream would draw unwanted attention, and how fast the local HOA would reveal themselves as obstacles rather than neighbors. At first, it was small things I noticed. A woman standing on the corner of the street, arms folded tightly, glaring as I backed the trailer into place. A man pausing his walk just long enough to take out his phone and snap what looked like a photo before hurrying along. Even as I unloaded the boat and checked the engine, I could feel the weight of eyes from behind closed blinds, like every move I made was being cataloged and judged. To me, it was just a boat. To them, I would soon find out, it was a violation. The letter came 2 days later, slid neatly into my mailbox without any prior conversation. The envelope carried the HOA's official seal with bold print across the top, demanding immediate compliance. The accusation was clear. My boat, parked in my own driveway, violated community guidelines. According to them, boats, trailers, or any large recreational vehicles were strictly prohibited from being visible from the street. The irony, of course, was that nearly every house along the lake had kayaks, canoes, or jet skis scattered along the shore. What was acceptable for long-term residents suddenly became an issue the moment I arrived with something larger and more visible. I read the letter twice, then set it down and looked out across the water. The lake stretched peacefully, its glassy surface dotted with small fishing boats from people who had lived here for years. If boats were truly against the rules, then the entire community was guilty, yet the HOA had singled me out. Their choice of words wasn't friendly or welcoming. They weren't suggesting or requesting. They were demanding. Already, I could sense what kind of relationship this was going to be. The next morning, the same woman who had glared at me on move-in day appeared on my property line, shouting something about rules being rules. She didn't introduce herself, nor did she ask any questions. She simply pointed at the boat and declared it unwelcome. I ignored her, not out of disrespect, but because I believed my property was mine to enjoy. If they wanted to escalate things, I would wait for their next move rather than fuel the confrontation on day one. By the end of the week, more letters followed. Each one grew increasingly stern, citing fines that supposedly would be levied if I failed to comply. The HOA claimed authority over not just my driveway, but the way I used the lake itself. They framed my boat as some kind of eyesore, a nuisance, and even suggested it diminished property values in the neighborhood. Their tone wasn't just strict, it was hostile, as if I were an intruder disrupting their carefully maintained image of order. Still, I held back. I paid close attention, not just to the letters, but to the way they operated. I watched meetings advertised on the bulletin board at the community center, and I noticed the same names appearing on every notice. The same woman who had shouted at me, the same man who had taken photos, and several others who seemed to operate like a private club. They were less concerned with the collective good of the community and more focused on control. The HOA, as it became clear, was not about maintaining property values or keeping the neighborhood safe. It was about authority, about a handful of individuals dictating the lives of everyone around them. As weeks passed, I began to gather my own information. I researched the HOA's charter, its limitations, and the exact boundaries of its influence. More importantly, I began to look deeper into the property I had purchased and the history of the lake itself. The first clue came from the deed, which mentioned not just the land beneath my home, but certain rights extending into the water. At first, I dismissed it as legal jargon, some outdated clause that no longer applied. But something told me to dig further. The more I read, the more interesting it became. This wasn't just about a piece of shoreline. My property included rights that extended into the lake itself, rights that weren't shared by everyone. Somewhere in the history of this land, ownership of the water had been structured differently than most people assumed. The HOA might have thought they ruled over everything, but their authority was paper-thin compared to what I was uncovering. Of course, I didn't reveal any of this right away. Instead, I let them continue their campaign, documenting every letter, every threat, and every attempt to shame me into compliance. I knew that eventually their overreach would give me the opportunity to push back in a way they didn't expect. For now, I allowed them to believe they were winning, even as I prepared for the inevitable clash. The boat remained in my driveway, covered neatly with a tarp, while the HOA fumed and plotted. They believed their guidelines were ironclad, their authority unquestionable. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was shifting, and none of them realized how much control they were about to lose. By the time the first official fine notice arrived, I was no longer frustrated or anxious. Instead, I felt calm, almost amused. The HOA was playing checkers, and I had already started playing chess. Every move they made only strengthened the case I was building. They believed they had cornered me. But what they didn't know was that the lake they claimed to control was mine in a way they couldn't yet comprehend. And so, with each passing day, I waited. The confrontation was coming, and when it arrived, the HOA would discover that their power ended not at the shoreline, but long before it. The first official fine notice was nothing more than a piece of paper, but the tone of it spoke volumes. It wasn't written as a warning, nor was it framed as an option. It was a demand, complete with a threat of legal action should I fail to comply. The HOA claimed my boat was a violation of community guidelines and that a fine of $500 would be levied immediately unless I removed it within 7 days. They used bold lettering, uppercase declarations, and legal sounding, jargon meant to intimidate. Yet what struck me most wasn't the fine itself, but the sheer arrogance behind it. It was as though they believed their rules carried the same weight as state law, as though the words typed on their stationery had unquestionable authority over every resident. The letter was followed quickly by harassment that was no longer subtle. I began to notice cars slowing down in front of my property, their drivers lingering long enough to glare or snap photos. One morning, I found a group of board members standing at the edge of my driveway, whispering to one another as if I were some kind of criminal to be monitored. The woman who had first shouted about rules became even bolder, approaching me directly as I loaded supplies into my garage. She lectured me about how outsiders had ruined communities like this one before, and how boats were not part of the aesthetic they worked so hard to maintain. Her words dripped with hostility, and though I didn't respond, her meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome here unless I bowed to their control. Despite their efforts, I did not move the boat. Each day it remained parked in my driveway was another act of quiet defiance, though in truth I wasn't being rebellious for the sake of rebellion. I simply knew something they didn't. Their threats were meaningless in the bigger picture. At that point, I had already secured a copy of the property records from the county office, and I had begun digging through old documents connected to the lake. What I found was fascinating. Decades earlier, when the land had first been developed, the original owners had established water rights that weren't typical. Instead of the lake being declared public or managed exclusively by the community, portions of it were tied directly to individual property deeds. My parcel, in particular, was unique. It didn't just grant me shoreline access, it granted me ownership that extended outward into the water. The precise language described it as exclusive rights to the water, body, its use, and its maintenance. At first, I had thought this was some outdated legal phrasing, perhaps even unenforceable. But when I brought the documents to a lawyer, the truth was confirmed. I owned the lake. Not figuratively, not partially, but in full. The weight of that realization settled on me slowly. While the HOA was busy writing angry letters and issuing petty fines, I was sitting on authority that dwarfed theirs entirely. They could argue about the visibility of a boat, but ultimately, their entire community relied on the very body of water that legally belonged to me. Every kayak, every jet ski, every fishing trip they enjoyed depended on my permission, whether they knew it yet or not. It was a discovery so powerful, so game-changing, that I decided to keep it hidden a little longer. Let them tighten the noose they thought they were placing around my neck. The more aggressive they became, the more foolish they would look when the truth surfaced. In the meantime, their escalation continued. I received yet another letter, this one claiming the fines would accumulate weekly until I complied. They spoke of potential liens against my property, threats of legal enforcement, and even mentioned the possibility of towing the boat at my expense. The language was crafted to instill panic, to corner me into surrendering before the situation grew costly. But instead of panicking, I meticulously documented each letter, filing them away in neat folders along with photos and timestamps. By now, I had also noticed something else: the hypocrisy. Several HOA board members owned their own recreational vehicles. One had a pair of jet skis tied to a dock that extended blatantly into the lake. Another had a canoe resting permanently on their shoreline. Yet none of these items were targeted or fined. The only reason my boat had become a battleground was because it was visible, larger, and belonged to someone who hadn't yet bent to their authority. Their rules weren't about consistency or fairness. They were about dominance. And that truth only reinforced my decision to push forward. Still, I remained patient. It would have been easy to storm into their next meeting, slam the deed on the table, and expose their lack of power. But timing was everything. I wanted them to double down, to dig their heels in so deeply that when the truth came out, there would be no walking it back. They would have exposed themselves as tyrants, and I would emerge not just as someone who resisted their pressure, but as the rightful authority they had no choice but to recognize. The turning point came when they attempted to enforce the fines. A notice arrived stating that the amount owed had surpassed $2,000, and that failure to pay would result in further legal consequences. They gave a date by which payment was required, confident that their threats would finally force my hand. But what they didn't realize was that I had already prepared my own move. The lawyer I had consulted confirmed everything I suspected. The HOA's authority did not extend into my ownership rights. Not only could they not enforce fines against me, but their entire use of the lake was contingent on permissions I now controlled. As I folded the notice and placed it in the growing pile of evidence, I realized the stage was nearly set. The HOA believed they were closing in on victory, but in truth, they were walking straight into a trap of their own making. Their arrogance, their hypocrisy, and their endless harassment had blinded them to the fact that the very resource their community revolved around was mine. The boat remained parked exactly where it had always been, standing as a silent challenge to their authority. And as I looked out across the lake that evening, watching the sun sink low over the water, I knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA discovered that their empire was built on land they didn't control. The next chapter of this battle was about to begin, and it would not be me who paid the price. The morning I woke to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door, I wasn't even surprised. By then, I had come to expect a steady escalation of threats and intimidation, each one louder and bolder than the last. This particular notice was written in all caps, declaring my property in violation of community regulations and threatening immediate corrective action. It stated that the HOA had scheduled a towing company to remove the boat from my driveway if I did not comply within 72 hours. The arrogance of the document was almost laughable. It wasn't written like a polite request from a neighborhood board. It read like an eviction order handed down by a self-appointed dictatorship. The notice went on to warn that the costs of towing, storage, and administrative fees would all be my responsibility. They claimed the HOA would also place a lien on my property to collect unpaid fines, a move they thought would finally break me into submission. But what they failed to realize was simple. None of it had legal teeth. They were so caught up in their own imagined authority that they hadn't stopped to ask whether their rules extended to someone like me. They were convinced that because they had gotten away with intimidating others, they could do the same to me. I left the notice taped to the door for the rest of the day, letting it flap in the breeze for every passing car to see. Neighbors slowed down, craning their necks as though expecting to witness some kind of spectacle. The HOA board members no doubt felt emboldened, believing they were moments away from a victory that would reaffirm their power. But behind the scenes, I was calm, steady, and deliberate. My lawyer had already prepared the necessary paperwork, and I had in my possession the documents that proved beyond question that the lake, the community's prized possession, was mine. Still, patience was important. If I acted too early, the HOA could spin the narrative, claim it was a misunderstanding, and quietly backpedal. No, I wanted them to push as far as they could, to reveal their true nature not just to me, but to every resident who had lived under their thumb. When the truth came out, it wouldn't just be me exposing them, it would be them exposing themselves. The HOA president, a woman named Linda, who had quickly become the face of the crusade against me, took things a step further. She organized a special community meeting, announcing it with flyers slipped into mailboxes and emails blasted out with dramatic subject lines like "Community Standards Under Threat." Her goal was clear: to turn the neighborhood against me, to frame me as some sort of rogue rule breaker who threatened the very fabric of their way of life. I was painted as the villain in their story, the outsider who dared to challenge their carefully manicured control. I attended the meeting, not because I was obligated to, but because I wanted to witness the performance. The community center was packed, folding chairs arranged in rows as residents murmured among themselves. Linda stood at the front like a politician on a campaign stage, clicking through a slideshow filled with photos of my boat, each one presented as though it were evidence in a trial. She spoke with passion about the importance of uniformity and order, warning that if one person was allowed to break the rules, chaos would follow. The irony was overwhelming. As she lectured about rules, I could see through the windows. The very lake she had no legal right to use without my permission. Dozens of boats, kayaks, and paddleboards bobbed in the water, each one technically on my property. The hypocrisy was almost too rich, but I held my tongue, knowing the right moment had not yet come. Neighbors raised questions during the meeting, some in support of the HOA, others skeptical of the extreme measures being proposed. A few brave souls even spoke up to say that fines and threats seemed excessive. Linda dismissed their concerns with a wave of her hand, doubling down on her message that the community would crumble if they didn't act decisively. She framed it as a battle of survival, with me as the enemy at the gates. When the floor was opened for comments, I stood. The room quieted, dozens of eyes turning toward me with a mix of curiosity and hostility. I didn't raise my voice or match Linda's theatrics. Instead, I calmly stated that the fines were unenforceable, the threats were hollow, and that the HOA's authority had limits. I didn't reveal the full truth, not yet. I simply reminded them that laws existed outside their bylaws, and that those laws were on my side. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd, but Linda quickly interrupted, accusing me of spreading misinformation. She declared that the HOA had consulted with legal experts and that their actions were completely justified. The meeting ended in tension, with no resolution reached, but I could see the doubt beginning to form in the minds of several neighbors. Afterward, the harassment only intensified. I found anonymous notes shoved under my door, warning me to play by the rules if I wanted to fit in. Cars drove by slower, lingering longer. Someone even left a printed copy of the community guidelines on my windshield, the section about unauthorized vehicles highlighted in neon yellow. It was as if they believed repetition would somehow make their rules more legitimate. Meanwhile, I continued to prepare. I gathered every piece of correspondence, every photo of their intimidation tactics, every flyer and email that portrayed me as a villain. My lawyer assured me that their threats of liens and towing were not just baseless, but potentially illegal. If they dared to touch my boat, they would open themselves to liability they couldn't afford. The 72-hour deadline came and went, and my boat remained exactly where it was. No tow truck arrived. No lien was filed. Their threats dissolved into silence, revealing just how powerless they truly were when faced with someone unwilling to bend. Yet I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA wasn't going to back down quietly. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They had invested too much energy into making an example of me, and they couldn't stomach the idea of losing. What they didn't realize was that their obsession was only tightening the trap. Each new threat, each public display, each attempt to shame me in front of the community was another nail in their coffin. The truth was waiting, ready to strike, and when it did, the fallout would be far greater than they ever imagined. I stood at the edge of the lake one evening, watching the water ripple under the fading light. Residents paddled by in canoes, laughing, and enjoying what they assumed was their community's pride and joy. But soon, they would all know the truth. The lake was mine, and with that revelation, everything the HOA thought they controlled would collapse. The time to reveal it was drawing closer. The turning point arrived on a cloudy Thursday morning when I stepped outside to find a tow truck idling at the edge of my driveway. The driver leaned against the hood, clipboard in hand, while two HOA board members stood nearby with self-satisfied smiles plastered across their faces. It was clear they had decided to move beyond threats and step into action, convinced that I would be powerless to stop them. The president, Linda, called out in a loud, triumphant voice, "This is your last chance. Remove the boat yourself, or we'll have it hauled away. You've left us no choice." She folded her arms, radiating authority she thought she actually had. I took a slow breath, not out of fear, but because I wanted to savor the moment. For weeks, I had allowed the HOA to play their game, to push harder and harder until they were overcommitted. Now they were about to learn just how flimsy their power really was. The tow truck driver shifted uneasily, clearly less confident than the board members who had summoned him. "You got the court order?" he asked Linda, his voice cautious. Linda waved a hand dismissively. "We don't need a court order. The HOA has full authority here. This vehicle is in violation of community standards." The driver frowned, glancing between us. He may not have known the details of HOA law, but he knew enough about liability to hesitate. I pulled a folded document from my jacket pocket and walked forward. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice level, "you do need a court order, and since none exists, if you touch my property, you'll be opening yourself up to a lawsuit." I handed him the paper, a copy of my lawyer's letter stating exactly that. He skimmed it quickly, then handed it back with a shrug. "Sorry, lady," he muttered to Linda. "I'm not risking my business for this. Call me when you have the proper paperwork." With that, he climbed into the truck and drove away, leaving, the HOA officials standing in awkward silence. The satisfaction was undeniable, but I wasn't done. Linda sputtered with indignation, shouting about insubordination and consequences. "You think this is over?" she snapped. "We'll take you to court if we have to. You can't just do whatever you want." I looked her in the eye and let the weight of my next words sink in. "You're right. None of us can do whatever we want. But there's a difference between authority you imagine you have and authority that actually exists. And you've just proven you don't know the difference." Then I turned and walked back inside, leaving her fuming in my driveway. That was the moment I decided it was time to stop waiting. They had overplayed their hand, and now the trap was ready to close. The first step was to make sure the community knew the truth. For too long, the HOA had operated by controlling information, spreading fear, half-truths, and intimidation. But transparency would shatter their hold faster than anything else. My lawyer and I drafted a detailed letter, complete with copies of the deed and ownership records. Every resident in the community received a copy, slipped into their mailbox, one evening after dark. By morning, whispers had already spread. The letter was simple. It stated that I was the legal owner of the lake, its water rights, and its shoreline access. It clarified that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the lake and no authority to regulate boats on it. And most importantly, it explained that while I had no intention of restricting responsible use, I had every right to do so if I chose. The reaction was immediate. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now approached me with questions. Some were angry, convinced it was a mistake. Others were curious, wondering how the HOA could have overlooked something so massive. A few quietly admitted they were relieved. Finally, someone had the power to stand up to the board. The HOA, of course, was furious. Linda and her allies scrambled to discredit the letter, claiming it was fabricated, an elaborate lie designed to undermine community unity. They held another emergency meeting, this time even more frantic than the last. But instead of uniting the neighborhood, their anger backfired. Residents demanded answers. If my claims weren't true, why not provide documentation proving otherwise? The board had no such proof. Their confidence began to crack. Meanwhile, I remained calm. I attended the meeting again, standing quietly at the back until Linda, red-faced and desperate, accused me of spreading dangerous misinformation. That was when I stepped forward and handed copies of the deed to several residents in the front row. They passed the papers back, each set of eyes widening as they saw the official seals and signatures. "This isn't misinformation," I said evenly. "It's public record. Anyone can verify it with the county clerk. The lake does not belong to the HOA. It belongs to me. And as the legal owner, I've allowed all of you to use it freely. That hasn't changed. But what has to change is the way this board operates. They've been threatening you with rules they don't have the power to enforce, using fear to control this community. That ends now." A murmur spread through the crowd, louder than anything Linda could shout over. For the first time, the narrative wasn't hers to control. Neighbors looked at her not with admiration but with suspicion. Questions turned into accusations, and the board members on stage shifted uncomfortably under the weight of dozens of stares. Linda tried to regain control, waving her arms and calling me a liar. But the tide had already turned. A resident stood up and demanded to know why the board had never disclosed this information. Another pointed out that the HOA had been collecting fees for lake maintenance despite not owning the lake at all. The hypocrisy was exposed in plain sight, and the anger was no longer aimed at me. It was aimed squarely at them. I left the meeting before it ended, walking out into the cool night air as the sound of raised voices echoed behind me. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in the community. I felt like the one person who had broken the spell the HOA had cast over everyone else. Back at home, I sat by the window, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across my lake. The fight wasn't over. I knew Linda wouldn't back down easily. Her pride was too great, her need for control too consuming. She would lash out again, and when she did, she'd only dig herself deeper. But for now, the balance had shifted. The truth was out. The community was awake, and the HOA was cornered. The trap had sprung, and there was no way back. The fallout from that meeting spread like wildfire. Within days, the calm surface of community life was gone, replaced by tension and suspicion. Neighbors who once blindly obeyed the HOA's directives now asked questions the board couldn't answer. Rumors traveled faster than facts, but the truth was undeniable. The board had been lying for years about its authority over the lake. That single revelation shattered the foundation they had built their control upon. Linda, however, refused to acknowledge defeat. Instead of stepping back, she doubled down. It was almost fascinating to watch, like seeing a cornered animal baring its teeth, not realizing that the fight was already lost. She issued new letters, thicker and angrier than the first ones, each dripping with threats of legal action. She called me an agitator, a fraud, a manipulator spreading confusion. She claimed the real ownership records were being withheld and that my documents were forgeries. But her words rang hollow, and the more she spoke, the less people listened. First cracks appeared when 2 board members quietly resigned. Their names appeared on a brief notice taped to the community bulletin board. Nothing more than a few sentences citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. They no longer wanted to be associated with a sinking ship. Without their support, Linda's circle of influence narrowed, leaving her with only the most loyal, or the most fearful, allies. I stayed patient. It was tempting to gloat, to shove the truth in their faces again and again. But I knew restraint was more powerful. Instead, I focused on reinforcing transparency. I hosted an informal gathering at my property, inviting neighbors to walk the shoreline, examine the documents for themselves, and ask questions without fear of HOA retaliation. To my surprise, nearly half the community showed up. They came carrying casseroles, lawn chairs, and more importantly, their frustrations. Around the fire pit that evening, stories spilled out. One man described being fined hundreds of dollars for planting a small vegetable garden. Another woman recounted how she was threatened with eviction notices over the color of her shutters. Parents shared how their children were reprimanded for playing too loudly in common areas. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone, that their grievances weren't isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of abuse. That night, a sense of solidarity bloomed. Neighbors who barely spoke to one another before now exchanged phone numbers, strategized, and even whispered about recalling the board entirely. It was clear that the power dynamic was shifting. The HOA was no longer feared, it was despised, but Linda wasn't finished. The following week, I received a certified letter delivered to my doorstep. Inside was a cease and desist order, crudely drafted and unsigned by any legitimate attorney. It accused me of slander, defamation, and illegal occupation of community resources. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't such a clear sign of desperation. She was throwing every accusation she could imagine, hoping one might stick. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I forwarded it to my lawyer, who sent a single devastating reply, a notice of potential countersuit for harassment and abuse of authority. It was short, professional, and enough to remind Linda that the legal system wasn't her toy. Still, she persisted. At the next board meeting, which I attended out of curiosity, Linda arrived armed with posters, charts, and a slideshow presentation. She shouted into the microphone, waving around blurry photocopies she claimed were proof the HOA controlled the lake. The documents were clearly outdated, bylaws from decades ago that referenced amenities never built and agreements long since expired. Residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she ranted, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. One brave neighbor finally stood up and interrupted. "Linda, enough! We've seen the county records. We know the truth. Stop insulting us with this performance." The room erupted in murmurs, and Linda's face turned scarlet. For a brief moment, she looked less like a leader and more like someone caught in a lie she couldn't escape, yet even then she refused to surrender. She accused the community of betrayal, insisting that without her, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. But the irony was clear. The chaos wasn't coming from the community. It was coming from her. As I watched her spiral, I realized something important. Her downfall wouldn't come from me. It would come from the very people she had ruled over for years. They no longer trusted her, and without their support, she was powerless. All I had to do was stand back and let nature take its course. Within days, petitions circulated. A group of residents organized a formal recall vote, citing abuse of authority, financial mismanagement, and dishonesty. Signatures piled up quickly, faster than Linda could counter. She tried to dismiss the effort as illegitimate, but the momentum was unstoppable. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about their frustration. Meanwhile, I noticed a shift in how my neighbors treated me. Where once they avoided me out of fear of HOA retaliation, now they waved when passing by. Some even stopped to thank me for standing up to the board. They didn't see me as an outsider anymore. They saw me as the catalyst for change. And yet, Linda still had one card left to play. Late one night, as I sat on the porch overlooking the lake, a pair of flashing headlights caught my eye. A truck pulled up near the water, and several figures stepped out, dragging something bulky behind them. I stayed in the shadows, watching as they attempted to dump debris into the lake. Old furniture, bags of trash, even rusted metal parts. It was sabotage, plain and simple, a desperate attempt to damage what they could no longer control. I called the sheriff immediately, providing details and waiting as the officers arrived. When the squad car pulled up, the figures froze, caught mid-act. Among them, unmistakably, was Linda herself, her hands clutching the corner of a broken fence post. The deputies didn't need much explanation. Dumping waste into a private lake was a criminal offense, and she had been caught red-handed. Her shrieks filled the night as they led her away, shouting about conspiracies and persecution. But her words had no power anymore. They were empty echoes in the darkness. The community awoke the next morning to the news. Their HOA president had been arrested. I knew this wasn't the final chapter yet, but it was close. The lake was safe, my ownership secure, and the board fractured beyond repair. What remained was the formal dismantling of their authority, and soon they would have no choice but to face the reality they had denied for so long. The queen had fallen, and her empire was crumbling around her. The morning after Linda's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed like a hive. People stood in driveways, whispering over coffee cups and shaking their heads. Kids on bicycles rode in circles around the community bulletin board where someone had taped up a printed news clipping. HOA president charged with illegal dumping in private lake. For years, she had been untouchable, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. But now, her reign had ended not with dignity, but with handcuffs. I watched it all quietly from my porch, sipping coffee while the sun rose over the lake. The water reflected orange and gold, unbothered by the chaos on its shores. It struck me, as fitting, the lake had endured long before the HOA, and it would endure long after them. The recall petition moved forward faster than anyone expected. With Linda out of the picture, the remaining board members tried to stall, insisting they needed more time, more signatures, more verification, but the residents weren't buying it anymore. At the next meeting, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up. People filled the folding chairs, lined the walls, and even spilled into the hallway outside. The energy was palpable, not fear, but determination. When the vote was called, the outcome was overwhelming. The board was dissolved. The announcement triggered cheers, hugs, and even tears. For many, it was the first time in years they felt free in their own homes. No more fines for mailbox paint colors, no more harassment about lawn lengths, no more threats over imagined infractions. The HOA was dead, but there was one lingering issue: the lake. For so long, the HOA had pretended to own it, charging usage fees for docks, fishing permits, and even small boats. They had built their authority around the water, claiming it was a shared resource under their stewardship. Now that illusion was shattered. At the final meeting, I stood and addressed the crowd. "I know there's been a lot of confusion," I began, "so let's clear it up once and for all. This lake has never been HOA property. It has always been privately owned, and for the last 2 years, it has been owned by me." A hush fell over the room. Dozens of eyes fixed on me, wide with surprise. Held up the certified county deed, the same document I had shown before, and passed it down the rows so everyone could see for themselves. "That means all of you, my neighbors, are welcome to enjoy it. Fish, boat, swim, relax. I won't charge you a penny. But it also means that no one, not a board, not a committee, not a single individual, can dictate its use anymore." Relief spread through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. People smiled, nodded, even clapped. The fear that the HOA might rise again and reassert control evaporated. They realized they no longer had to play by arbitrary rules. But then, like a ghost refusing to leave, Linda returned. After a brief stay in county jail, she reappeared at the next gathering, her once polished appearance replaced by a disheveled edge. She barged into the hall, clutching a stack of papers, shouting about her innocence and promising to sue anyone who stood in her way. "You can't do this!" she screamed, slamming her papers onto the table. "That lake is ours. It belongs to the community, not some outsider with money to burn." The room went silent, not out of respect but out of pity. I rose calmly and faced her. "Linda, the community is free now. They know the truth. And as for the lake, I own it. Legally, undeniably, permanently." I stepped closer, lowering, my voice just enough so only she and those in the front row could hear. "You spent years lording over these people, pretending to have power you never really had. But now, the irony is simple. If you want to set foot in the water, you'll need my permission." The words hung in the air like a hammer dropping. For the first time, Linda had no response, no shouting, no threats, no fake documents. Just silence. Her face paled, her eyes darting around the room, searching for support that wasn't there. The neighbors she once commanded now looked at her with disdain. Some even turned away entirely, unwilling to waste another moment on her delusions. Slowly, she gathered her papers and stormed out. The door slammed behind her, and that was the last time she ever tried to assert control over the lake. The weeks that followed were transformative. Without the HOA, the neighborhood began to breathe again. People painted their houses the colors they wanted. Children played freely without fear of fines. Gardens bloomed. Fences went up or came down. And for the first time in years, the community felt alive. As for the lake, it became a symbol of renewal. Families gathered on weekends for picnics by the water. Teenagers kayaked across its glassy surface. Fishermen cast lines at dawn without worrying about permits. I even helped organize a summer festival, food trucks, music, and fireworks, reflected over the lake's shimmering expanse. Through it all, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because I had won some battle, but because balance had been restored. The HOA's reign of control was over, and in its place, genuine community thrived. One evening, as the festival lights twinkled across the water and laughter echoed along, "The shore?" A neighbor approached me. "You know," she said, handing me a plate of barbecue, "you didn't just save us from the HOA. You gave us back our lake." I smiled, glancing at the water. "No," I replied, "it was always yours to enjoy. I just reminded you that no one had the right to take it away." The lake rippled in the fading light, timeless and serene. It had outlasted Linda's tyranny, the HOA's lies, and the fear that had gripped the community. And as I watched my neighbors celebrate, I knew one thing for certain. The water was finally free. And so were we.